First, I'm going to unmute myself. Then I'm going to drop some homework in the chat, and now I'm going to share my screen. Last time I did a 5-minute talk, I got really caught out in how many digressions I take. So I'm going to try really hard not to do that this time. And I'm going to start here with my first slide. And my thanks go to the Center for Service Learning, Dr. Jamela Watson-Thompson, Emily Roundtree, Mindy Paget, my fellow panelists, and everybody here. I'd like to acknowledge another guest in the room, which is our collective exhaustion, and hasten to tell you that my presentation today on creative documentation is not designed to make more work. Instead, I hope that by expanding the palette to include artists in a structural way, the work that you do in community engaged scholarship can be shared and expanded. Oh, there we go. So creative documentation. Creative documentation serves as another form of knowledge generation that has the potential to shift power by offering a better understanding of creative and cultural practice inside of communities. That's really my favorite evolving definition of what creative documentation is. Comes from Chris Johnson, an artist who was brought into work with the CDI, Community Development Initiative, which is given a more expanded definition here. I won't read the whole thing, but as you can see, it suggests that creative documentation is the application of artistic and/or cultural practice to the purpose of describing or representing information about a subject in a research context. It goes on to suggest that it's really more than illustrating, that it's more than presenting. And I'd like to point out that this community development investments is connected to PolicyLink and ArtPlace America, which, if you come to my workshop at 1:30, you will learn a lot more about because they have been pretty heavy hitters. So recently something has occurred that reminds us of the power of art to express what is important, but cannot be captured in words. And some of this idea of expanded process, expanded knowledge making is based on Howard Gardner's idea of multiple intelligences, but I'll call them multiple practices. I think that makes a lot more sense in the arts. And honestly, it makes a lot more sense in community engaged scholarships because we can all participate in art making practices in creative documentation. You can see how Gardner's multiple practices sort of map on to the art world. And by using them and engaging with them and engaging with people who have developed these practices over long periods of time with deep bodies of theory and evidence, as was suggested by the keynote speaker, you can really jumpstart your organization's ability to do the things that we believe creative documentation can in fact provide. So here I'm just giving you a glance of the last few months. I think we've all seen of how much there has been this effort to engage in artists and cultural practices to deal with COVID-19 and its various ramifications upon multiple communities. Recognizing the specific impact of artists and cultural barriers in communities have become extremely important. And here's the CDC repping artists to scientists, telling you guys that we're right here in the middle. I don't know that that's always necessarily true, and certainly isn't true for all artists. But I love that the CDC has been putting out all of these various field guides. And a lot of the things that I dropped into the chat are, in fact, field guides to practicing work with artists, suggestions, models for work that have been put out by a broad range of individuals, organizations, and groups to help engage in this practice. We'll be going over some of those opportunities in the workshop. These are some of the things that CDC suggests artists uniquely bring to the table when we're trying to communicate with organizations or communicate with individuals, with cultures to change the needle, move the needle on public health, on understanding complicated situations. The suggestion is that arts turn information into narratives, images, and symbols that resonate deeply and move past intellectual arguments to embodied dialogue, knowing, and action. Well, we hope. We don't always know, but it's a nice thing to try. So creative documentation includes and expands upon a number of things that will already be extremely familiar to people working in community engagement or in community activities, such as strategic planning, asset mapping, staff and stakeholder engagement, all of the things, environmental design and design research. But the goal of it, the goal of working in creative documentation specifically with artists, is to increase types of knowledge generated from research, to expand the reach of your program, to increase transparency, to increase assessment options, to create clarity of vision, and to engage with sustainable practices. My own work with nonprofit organizations focuses on ethical practices that are also sustainable within the organization. Because one thing, this is how it differs a little bit from the age-old practice of community groups working with organizations, because for community groups, they've been working with artists for a long time, community engaged scholars, and for artists, it's almost impossible to function outside of a community. It's different though, because it's research centered, documentation and research are at the core. There's a deeper engagement, generally lasts for a longer period of time, and it recognizes the knowledge creation value of art practices. So much of this work, especially when I do it with smaller organizations with smaller budgets that are outside of things like maybe KU's wonderful and substantial set of resources, is we're often trying to replace expensive sort of one-off costs for advertising agencies or others to produce materials for grants or communications. We're trying to tone down that kind of stressful, we have to tell our story, that can feel like it gets everybody on edge. Nobody knows what to do, and often requires volunteers and staff people to work beyond their scope of job and beyond their skill set on occasion, although training in those areas can be a beautiful and beneficial thing, allowing your staff and volunteers to tell your story in a way that feels strategic and complete. And it also, we were trying to diminish the accidental exploitation of artists through late placement or lack of resource, and to diminish poor fits between research and accessible outcome, information or outreach, not using artists' work as an illustration. And another piece is to remember that some of this work, which connects and conjoins with creative placemaking, also carries with it the strategic calamities of creative placemaking when they are calamities, which can be whitewashing, greenwashing, redwashing, other versions of, in some ways, papering over many of the stresses of community development. So all of these things help us sort of, I just gave an example, but we'll sort of pass back through that. We'll get to more examples at 1 o'clock. How to pitfalls, examples, and artist researchers, including a sort of deep dive into the Pollinators Project, is going to happen at 1:30. And again, workshop at 1:30. We've got some pre-recorded content from Megan Kaminsky and Joey Orr. We are very fortunate to have here on campus, as Joey is a wonderful connector, as his entire placement in the Spencer Museum of Art is geared towards a research initiative. And Megan does an enormous amount as an individual artist and as a member of the KU community to connect both with other scholars and with her larger practice beyond poetry into environmental and care work. One thing that sometimes people ask is, how do you find artists? And that's going to be one of the things we go over in the workshop as well. Looking at databases, a lot of it is finding an artist who can tell you about other artists, because one thing people are very good at is usually boosting up the people around them who are doing the kind of work that you're hoping to engage with. Mm-hmm. So we often see people like, for instance, people in theater, our sound recording artists will be invited into spaces to think about how the physicality of the space will affect individuals who are in it. We've seen a lot of that work in healthcare, both mobile and sort of redesigned healthcare areas while we're going through these giant vaccination clinics. So we've been seeing a lot of artists coming in to try to understand how to make a space or information somehow work together better with the human interface past the information interface. So getting people to come in and embody the experience that that your clients or the individuals that you're working with are going to be going through, and give you feedback on that experience, or to build information in.
I wonder if you could give some more examples of how creative documentation plays out in your work or other work that you've been involved in.
Yeah, absolutely. I've done a lot of work placing various animators with individuals and various theater people with different individuals. In my own work, I've spent quite a bit of time in groups that were, for instance, a group in Philadelphia working with combat veterans. I'm trying to think of the right way to put this. Combat veterans who wanted to work within the theatrical understanding in order to deal with their fears and anxieties. There was a group here that did a pretty similar thing. Mine was a number of years ago back in Philadelphia. And in that, we utilized those sort of behind the scenes pieces, the creative documentation of the process itself, so that the artwork came out of this long process of writing and performing. We filmed the process of writing and performing, and that part became both a document for research itself, to be able to look at it, to be able to think with great complexity and depth about what the polls were, so that we could move those to other workshops since this was the first one. But in addition, so the documentation became a research opportunity and I think that's how a lot of creative documentation is handled, that the documentation itself becomes another piece of research opportunity, similar to the story maps that I think in many ways we just saw with Sarah, because you can see the overall sets of questions, they become more cumulative, or you can look into those archives, not just the things that were released. So things like that, and then also opportunities to engage with audio work, to engage students and younger people in creating audio around their experiences during COVID specifically has come up a number of times. So the idea of allowing yourself to work with a researcher and to bring what you know and what you understand to be compelling, accessible, and generative within your art practice.